Hi friends. So I saw an image the other day online, and I'll just show you it quickly. It said, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." And it's an African proverb. When I heard that, it really resonated with me because it's something that you see over and over again today. See it in countries that are affected by Western imperialism and war, where you have people joining various groups because they're so fed up of their country being destroyed by Western imperialism, and after a while they lose all their humanity, and they're looking for some connection because their country or their communities are being destroyed, and they're so angry about Western imperialism and occupation of their country, and so they're desperate, and they're tired of their religion, if indeed they have a religion, or whether they just think that they're following a religion, which is, unfortunately, Wahhabism is a distortion of Islam, and so there are people who follow that. They barely know anything about the Quran, but anyway, whatever they're doing, they're looking for some connection. And I think about this often because there are lots of examples of people who've lost their connection. There's also examples of, there are a lot of men who don't know how to be because they're told that there's these mixed messages. The same with women. There's mixed messages about being tough still and not being able to show emotion and so forth. And then they seek out, and depending on what community or country they belong to, they seek out some meaning in groups. And even if that means they seek out meaning in, say, white supremacist groups, which fit into their belief system, or that they want to blame a certain group for and that often it's punching down on minority groups. They want to blame certain groups for, instead of looking to, the power structures and the governments and the politicians who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is basically serving the public. So they, instead of looking to those as the culprits, they turn on people that are vulnerable. This happens all over the place. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Now, I'm not making excuses for men who do this, or I'm not making excuses for anybody who is perpetrating violence against different groups, but there is a lot of displacement today with people, no matter, and I'm not just talking about men, I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about victims of Western imperialism. I'm just talking in general because of, capitalism will always be a problem because it's always going to be exploitative. That's the nature of capitalism. And neoliberalism is always going to be a problem. And we've all been, communities have been atomized due to neoliberalism. There's, social media, even though it's brought people together, has also taken people apart, where people tend to focus on certain interests and they forget about everything else. And the mainstream media, if you've seen that recent On Contact with Chris Hedges, where he interviews Matt Taibbi, who talks about how the mainstream media, he takes it further than Noam Chomsky, talking about manufacturing of consent, and he talks about how they've made it almost like a worldwide wrestling match where there's the baddie and the goodie, but they select who is the baddie. Like if it's somebody who's been, somebody who is, say, a communist or socialist, but they've been sort of injured or killed or whatever, they don't show any interest in that because that goes against their business model. And if they're, but they might show interest in someone who was killed that is part of their tribe, so to speak, or part of the system, capitalist system or the imperialist system. And here's Alia. She likes to come in and visit. So that's the thing. The mainstream media now, it's been setting up people that you should hate. Oops. The mainstream media has been setting up people that you should hate, and deciding who we should hate, which is usually vulnerable groups, and heroic, holds up, sort of a pedestal those that should not be held up on a pedestal. That's sort of imperialist warmongers and all that kind of thing. So it's sort of like, and it's actually ended up with people being only hearing the opinions that are sort of their own of something that doesn't challenge them. So he was talking about that, and of course that reinforces this separation of all of us, really, and that instead of looking at the power structures and structural racism and all of that, and heterosexism and all of that, we start, a lot of us start turning on one another. You know how it is when when one can feel irritated. Sometimes you can take it out on somebody that has nothing to do with that, with your irritation. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do when they feel like they're being trapped by the system, where they're poor or they're black or they're living in a situation that is they cannot get out of, which is what a lot of neoliberalism has brought us now. Extreme poverty and inequality, and capitalism, of course, has brought extreme inequality and imperialism, because it's inextricably linked with capitalism. Imperialism is. So when you get a lot of people who are feeling disaffected, and they'll turn on instead of turning to the structures of power and the state, they end up turning on one another. Anyway, this is what we have now, and it's only going to get worse from now on until we probably, and I believe, until we have some sort of a socialist society, because capitalism just doesn't work. So, and it's an ecocide happening right now. So, when I was watching, she's looking for something to do. When I was watching Russell Brand. He's a comedian, also a writer, social activist, I guess you could call him. And he was talking about, he has a YouTube channel, and he was talking about how, he was talking about anxiety and fear. And something he said, which I'll share with you. Before I actually talk about what he says, I must say that, it doesn't always, when with the way the world is, and how many disenfranchised people there are and so forth, we don't always have to end up turning on the more vulnerable of us. For example, in Venezuela, with all the crippling US sanctions that are happening, Venezuelans are actually, because they want to keep the Bolivarian revolution going, they all turn to one another to support one another. And that would be something that would be a great outcome for the more oppressive things that are happening today, if we all turn to one another instead of turning away from one another and trying to blame people around us. And that's where learning about MMT comes in too, because I'm not going to go into why that is, but you should check that out, because that if you have an understanding of a sovereign economy, that will really benefit you, and also reduce some of this blaming groups for taking away your money, via taxes and all this sort of thing. This myth that federal taxes fund spending, and that somehow people, other groups that are disenfranchised, are taking away our money or something, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go into that, but just look for the hashtag LearnMMT and check that out. So, but the Venezuelans are all banding together, and this can be a good outcome for this extreme sort of inverted totalitarianism, really, that's happening in the United States, and which is starting to happen around the world. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, inverted totalitarianism, she's determined to come in here and get my attention. So if you see the camera shaking, you know that Ali is here trying to get my attention. Anyway, so inverted totalitarianism was a term invented by Shellen Walden, and it says it's different from classical forms of totalitarianism. It does not find its expression in a dangerous or charismatic leader, but in the faceless anonymity of the corporate state. Our inverted totalitarian pays outward fealty to the facade of electoral politics, the constitution, civil liberties, freedom of the press, the independence of the judiciary, and the iconography, traditions, and language of American patriotism. But it has effectively seized all the mechanisms of power to render the citizen impotent. And that's true, because as you can see I haven't forgotten about talking about Russell Brand and his video Fear and Anxiety. This is all related. But, this is the sort of thing that we have going now, inverted totalitarianism in the United States. Gives all the impressions of sort of democracy and all of that, and that we have some sort of power. But in fact, it's really its own, the state is owned really by and directed by corporations. And that's happening slowly in Australia. And now that we once again have a right-wing government, Scott Morrison here in Australia, that's only going to get worse. So this is sort of like going to just accelerate, and eventually will all sort of countries will probably have this inverted totalitarianism. So this is why we have to turn to one another and support one another. And this sort of this kind of dissing identity politics, which when presented, this idea of identity politics is exploited by institutions like the Democratic Party, who exploit it so that they can use different people as bait, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Kamala Harris, women of color, and all this kind of thing. They exploit identity politics. It's not really identity politics, and anybody who is in a minority group has every right to organize, and it's very important to do so. So, when you hear people sort of blaming identity politics for the reason the left is, the real left is kind of in a mess, that's not really fair, because identity politics in itself is actually fine as long as those that are promoting a certain rights for a certain group also recognize the struggles of other groups and realize that it is a class struggle. Ultimately, it's a class struggle, and that we can't get lost in our own our own minority groups and thinking that and not being aware of the greater issue, which is a class struggle. And that's where I would criticize identity politics, in that I've seen it myself, with certain groups who are totally focused on their own thing, and they cannot, they don't sort of acknowledge other people's struggles very much, if at all. So that's a problem. But I just thought I'd throw that in there, because I've noticed that a lot of people who would consider themselves on the left are blaming identity politics, even though what is presented to us as identity politics by the Democratic Party in the US is really just an exploitation of that. It's completely shallow and false. And it's really just using different groups as bait to bring people into that awful party, that awful warmongering corporate-owned party. So anyway, I'm digressing. So I'll go back to Russell Brand and this video I saw of him, which is related to that image I showed you in the beginning. He was talking about fear and anxiety. At the end of the video, he said, "I would say that many of the problems we have today is from having lost contact with the indigenous and native way in which we are supposed to live, in communities with one another, with tribal connections to one another, with purpose and meaning, which would once have been derived from our requirements to survive. Now happily removed, or at least reappropriated in the need to work, need to earn money, indirect obligation to duties, rather than to forage, hunt, gather, etc. And remember, I'm vegan, so I'm not talking about hunting animals or anything. This is more about the idea of, community and being in communities. So rather than to forage, hunt, gather, etc., that our bodies and minds were cultivated in and conceived in, created in. So I suppose the spiritual solution must be to do as best we can to recreate our native traditions. I don't think he's actually meaning literally creating native traditions, through gratitude, service, connections to others. I hope that's the answer, because I don't want to live my life in continual anxiety looking for temporary solutions. So I hope that's true. So that's Russell Brand in his video about anxiety and fear. And I've often thought that, and I've had numerous discussions over the years about this, the lack of community, like even here where I live, rurally, where we are in some ways cut off from like-minded people, in that, that we don't really, well, firstly, we don't really know who our neighbours are, except for maybe really close neighbours nearby, and some we have things in common with and others not so much, but we all communicate with each other when there's times like the bushfires in the beginning of the year, which were very scary, and if you followed my channel, you know what I mean by that. So that's the sort of thing that people would have done in the old days, when they didn't have TV and even radio or any sort of communication. They had to kind of keep in contact with each other and support one another. And if there was some sort of disaster that happened, everybody would band together, because it's in the best interest of the community. And you get to trust one another, even if you don't really have that much in common with each other. You get to trust each other because you've been in one another's spaces. You know what it's like when people are working in the same sort of organization, and they come in the morning and they see each other every day. And even though you may not have much in common with those people, you get to kind of trust them, because after many months of seeing each other every day, just being in these spaces with each other, I mean, we're just animals. You get to know people, and you get to trust people in one way or another, or not trust people. You sort of it's this being in the physical space, which is what a lot of us don't have anymore. And the only time I probably experience sort of community is, we try and, where we are, we try and sort of cultivate a sort of nice feelings towards neighbours and vice versa, by sort of offering to do stuff. If we go down to pick up something from town, or if something wrong happens, if somebody goes away and they need somebody to check out and look after their place, keep an eye on it. Or in cases like the fires, where we didn't have to literally go across to our neighbours and talk to them, because we had SMS, we could text each other, but we were basically keeping in contact of if there was going to be embers starting to come across the river and start, real problems over on our side of the river, because there was really serious fires in Tasmania this year, in the beginning of this year. So we were able to do that. And that's sort of something that has been kind of lost, is this sort of, people don't really know in many ways who they're living next to anymore, and they don't really entirely trust anybody, because they've never really been in physical spaces with them and seen them often. And that can be, of course, just because people are constantly, there's this impermanence of people living in areas because of neoliberalism. People keep having to change jobs or find some sort of job, or it's kind of in some ways destroyed community. I could go into that more, but that's all I'll say about that. But it's like, so we don't really have those connections with people anymore, and we don't really even know who we're living next door to most of the time, particularly if you live in urban areas and you live in a building. People are finding community now online, and have been for some time, and so they're all grouping together in these virtual communities, but they're not really the same. It's not really the same being in a virtual community, because they're really just usernames on a board or usernames on a page or a group, and you don't have that important sort of physical interaction and seeing people's expressions and their behaviors. And that's why there's a lot of one of the reasons there's a lot of rudeness online is because there's no accountability, and people can just be anonymous users basically. Anyway, there's a lot of people looking for connection online, and I have to say that because we don't have as much like-minded people, say, in our area, we also derive a sort of support in a way just by being a part of, say, people who are on the left, who want to end wars and want to end imperialism and want to end social inequality and all that kind of thing. I find sort of support online just by not literally talking to people, but just the fact that they have those same sort of attitudes and same sort of values. But, that's not the same in some ways. It's very important to me, of course, but it's not the same as, say, physically having some friend or friends. I have a few friends that are sort of like that, but I don't see them very much because they live in another part of, they live, a couple of hours away or whatever, an hour and a half away, so I don't get to see them so much. But we all need to have some sort of community in a way. And that's why so many people are looking to communities online, because that's in some ways been lost. And that's really bad in some ways. But of course the online is really great for realizing there's a lot of people who have felt really isolated in the way they are. For example, say trans people have been able to connect online. They felt like they were the only person who was trans in their area or something, or in their state. And then they meet other people who have, who have stories to tell about that and have experiences of the same kind, all that kind of thing. So online is very important as well. But nothing in some ways beats this sort of like a physical community. I really feel like that. And I really agree with Russell Brand in that, as he said, service is a really important thing. That saying, if you want to be happy, benefit others. If you sort of, if we're always just sort of thinking about ourselves and how unhappy we are and how we don't have this and don't have that, if we're not grateful for what we have, then we become discontented. But if we're grateful for what we have, even if it's not much, if we're grateful for what we have, and if we try and be of service to others and benefit others, then that certainly can make one happier. And it also creates a trust and all of that. So, that's a really, really important thing. Anyway, but you can tell by the number of suicides that are happening in the world how many people, and there's many. I mean, I think every 8 minutes or something somebody kills themselves, or every 10 minutes in the world someone kills themselves. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, of course, but, I really think that part of it is just not feeling like they belong, not feeling like they are connected to anybody, and feeling isolated. And also, poverty and feeling victimized and all of that kind of thing leads to that. And, so the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Even the people who are in power, I can't say that anybody who is happy oppressing, like for example Rupert Murdoch, who seems to take delight in sort of putting his foot on the throats of unemployed people or different ethnic groups or Muslims or whatever. I can't say that anybody who really is like that is in any way truly happy. They might think they're happy and they might take great delight in doing that in some ways, but inside, how happy can you be if that's how you sort of derive some sort of feeling of satisfaction, feeling satisfaction at the expense of others, at the victimization of others. So, I don't know how people like that became that way. I think actually having power over time robs people of their empathy. That saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that that's in some ways true. And I think that a lot of these people in power, it's just too easy to affect the lives of many, many people. And I think after a while, they don't see people, everyday people, as real people. They see them as just statistics and consumers, and they don't see them that way. And I think in some ways, some people who have this sort of a bit of a psychopathic or sociopathic, whatever it is, bent, end up sort of like they end up going for those positions of power and then ending up exploiting and harming other people. So, but that's another example of I don't know, they're incapable of empathy, incapable of empathy towards others, and then so they end up persecuting people. There's all kinds of, I think, examples of those who are not embraced. I don't know, that's probably not the best example, but I think there's a lot of examples of that African proverb today in the world, and there's all sorts of ways that we burn it down to feel its warmth when we feel isolated or rejected and so forth. Growing up in a certain minority group, I understand also, the isolation of that being, I don't really like to label myself particularly much, but I guess you would say that I was same-sex attracted, and still am, of course, but it's like I grew up in the 60s and it was really not even mentioned then, but I knew at a certain point not to ever mention it, not to talk about it, not to act on any sort of feelings towards other people of the same sex, and that's a sort of an isolation that happens, and not that I felt like I wanted to start attacking other groups or but it's like with some people, if they're vilified, if they're rejected, if they're bullied, and I wasn't necessarily bullied at school because I wasn't really out at school because it wasn't safe. I knew that there must have been something wrong with it, even though I actually didn't feel there was anything wrong with me, but I knew that there must be something wrong with it because nobody seemed to be like me or talking about it. And eventually when I got to be in my teens, I realized that there must be something wrong with it. And that's the thing, when, if you're in minority groups, you can, that's a sort of an isolation, and so you gravitate initially to groups that are like you, to people that are like you, to feel support and not feel alone. People don't always have that in the countries that they live in, because some are extremely homophobic or whatever, they're heterosexist to the extreme, and so that isn't always availed. It wasn't so bad in Australia, but it wasn't good, and there's all sorts of ways that people are excluded. And like an example of say the Columbine massacre in the late 90s, there was a transcript of one of the boys who was killing students in the Columbine massacre. He said to this one of these kind of jocks, I guess you could call them, sport kind of guys, who had actually been persecuting the shooter, persecuting the guy who was killing people at school. He turned to that guy and pointed the gun at him, and he said, that you used to call me a faggot and all this kind of thing. And he was, basically, even in that moment of all this sort of where they were murdering children, murdering students that really had nothing to do with their persecution, him feeling isolated or whatever. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the shooter's name, the guy who was doing the shooting. It doesn't really matter, but a lot of the students that he killed had nothing to do with his isolation or his persecution. This particular jock who they used to wear those baseball caps around, apparently, so they were actually wanting to kill those people first, and nobody stood up. They said everybody who's I forget, they asked everybody in the cafeteria, the ones that were these sports guys, to sort of stand up, and they didn't stand up. So then they sort of said, okay, well, we'll just, and basically decided to sort of kill everybody. And these were the guys, the sports guys, the jocks, who were the ones that were sort of persecuting them at school, or at least one of them at school. And so that's when he said to that guy, and he didn't end up shooting that guy who was actually had been calling him faggot and everything. He left him alive. He didn't shoot him, which is a very interesting thing. And I'm not sure why. Maybe he decided that was he had the absolute power at that point, and that he was going to let that guy remember that he had the power to kill him, and he didn't at that time. It's a very odd thing. So, but that's an example of somebody who was, people didn't notice that or didn't act on it enough, or didn't act on it at all, and he ended up, it ended up in a tragedy of killing a whole lot of innocent people. So anyway, there's a lot of people that disaffected today, and it's only going to get worse. There's a lot of people feeling isolated, and that's only going to get worse unless we start, trying to build communities and stuff. And that's what Russell Brand was saying, and I've been thinking about that for a while. We try to sort of build some kind of community where we are in this rural area, which I think we have in some ways. And also there's a cafe nearby where there's two gay guys who own the cafe. They're married, and they try to build community in that cafe. There are sort of all these different ways, and they have. It's a really great community down at this BS cafe. And there's all sorts of ways that we can build community. It doesn't have to be around certain interests necessarily, but just sort of where we show care and love to others so that people don't feel isolated and they don't feel like, that's so important, particularly in this day and age where we're heading towards this sort of inverted totalitarianism, or the lords and serfs sort of a situation. And before capitalism falls in a heap, if ever it does, it's going to only get worse and worse. And so, that's something that we have to try and avoid, is people just feeling so isolated that they kill themselves, or so isolated that they want to kill other people, which unfortunately in a patriarchal society, a lot of men, particularly white men, young white men, tend to go that way, or they kill their whole families, or they kill their partners. There's something that's for another video, but that's a whole other sort of really unfortunate thing that patriarchy has brought us. I don't know if I did a very good job at sort of pulling that together, but I just, when I saw that image, I just thought, God, that's so sad. It just resonates with me. You see it time and time again. People joining groups that it's not so good that they're in those groups, and there's violence associated with it, and then taking out that violence, punching down on minority groups and all that kind of thing. The sort of it's a kind of looking for meaning in things that aren't so good, and looking for kinship, because they don't know where to go, and so they end up getting together in toxic situations. And why do they seek out these toxic situations where there's violence and where there's attacking of other groups, like these white supremacist, white nationalist groups? There's various explanations for that, but I mean, at a really base level, there are people looking for a group where they feel like they're a part of that group. I mean, it's really sad that it's that kind of group, and that it's, that there's sort of these values of racist things, and racism and homophobia and transphobia and all of that. But still, it's something that they feel a part of. But we have to provide, well, firstly, we have to encourage children to be empathetic with one another and be sensitive, and not see that as some threatening thing that, oh no, you're trying to turn boys into girls and all that nonsense. Empathy and care and love is a human thing. It's not a gendered thing. It's not a male-female, this BS of masculinity and femininity, which are just sort of constructs. We have to encourage children to care about others, and that includes non-human animals by being vegan, stop persecuting the vulnerable, and when we absolutely don't need to. These are all things that we can start doing, and stop playing into these ridiculous gendered things that boys are tough and they have to show no emotion and yada yada, and elevating that in some ways as, oh, he's so strong because he doesn't show any emotion, he doesn't really he's not fearful, and all this nonsense, all that kind of thing. We have to get beyond that and start being a society that values human qualities, and sort of care and compassion and justice and equality and all of that. And then maybe we might have a chance. And even if we are going to go extinct through this climate crisis that's happening now, at least by that stage we can be something better than what we have been in the past. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So thanks so much for watching. Please click the subscribe button if you like the content, and please click the notifications bell if you want to receive updates. And click the like button if you like the content, and please leave comments. I always enjoy your comments. And thank you so much for your support, and thanks so much for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.